They say history is written by the conquerors. The native people, whether it's here or anywhere around the world, you know, their story is often lost through time and history. And no one knows about this battle. There's very little in the literature. If you do research, if you do go online, you can find very scant, you know, references. You know, it's like for America, you know, the Revolutionary War. It's of that importance to the local Indians here. It's a sad chapter in California history.
The 1846 Temecula Massacre was the deadliest incident of the Mexican-American War in California. As many as 100 Temecula Indians were killed during the ambush. However, it has not been remembered that way. Instead, the Battle of San Pasqual has been documented as the bloodiest conflict of the war, with 18 American casualties. But the lesser-known Temecula Massacre and the events leading up to this tragic incident reveal a complex and often suppressed narrative of California history.
Since I was little, I've always heard of the Temecula Massacre, and people talked about it as a seminal event here in the valley and at Pechanga.
Snap your W-2 and file your taxes 100% free. Plus, get your biggest refund. Roughly 37% of filers qualify.
It was a Spanish period where we were enslaved by the missions, and they actually came out here and trying to find new people to work the missions in the fields. Whenever they came through this valley, the local Indians, the Temecula Indians, they would run for the hills because they knew what was going to happen.
In 1821, Mexico achieved independence from Spain. Alta California, now known as the state of California, came under the rule of the new Mexican government, and the leadership believed the California mission system, established by the Spanish, had failed in its efforts to assimilate the native people. In 1834, the missions were disbanded, and the large land holdings, livestock, and wealth was redistributed to Mexican citizens in the form of land grants, also called ranchos. Within 2 decades, over 800 were granted in California. As part of the redistribution process, the native people released from the atrocities of mission servitude were supposed to receive plots of land to settle and live on as Mexican citizens. However, the Mexican government awarded very few land grants to native people. Instead, the majority of the mission populations were displaced and landless, forced to live on the ranchos and work as unpaid laborers. Most of their traditional villages and gathering areas were located inside the boundaries of privately owned ranchos. Tribal people returning to these areas were considered squatters or tenants in their own traditional homelands. As the Mexican government opened up settlement in Alta California, the Californio identity emerged. The Californios profited off established mission enterprises and the labor of native people who were forced, again, to adapt to a new era of oppression and turmoil.
This is post-mission period. What happened is, as these Californios came in and asserted their claims that they were given by the Mexican government, they began to continue to dispossess the Indian people that were living on the land. It was really just depredation after depredation. Our Indian people, they were not viewed as people by the Californios. Their lands were taken. Some of the people were indentured or they were enslaved.
In 1843, 22 years after Mexico achieved independence from Spain, the United States declared war on Mexico. The Mexican-American War largely stemmed from Americans' eagerness to expand westward to the Pacific Ocean. As many American settlers ventured west, they began to resent the fact that the lands in California and the Southwest were territories of Mexico. This created political divisions between the Californios and the American settlers, who had emigrated to obtain land, particularly in the densely populated pueblos like San Diego or Los Angeles. This conflict ignited further hostilities toward native peoples.
Our people, Payomkowachum, our Luceño people, had allied with the Americans that were coming in from the east.
Because of what happened with the Spanish and the Mexican period. And so, well, we didn't do so well with the Mexicans and the Spanish. So let's try the Americans. And the Cahuillas, they were aligned with the Mexicans. That was kind of the genesis of the problem in, before the massacre here in this canyon.
In late September 1846, General Stephen Watts Kearny and his Army of the West set out for California from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Their military campaign was to assist in the capture of California for the United States. A couple of weeks into their journey, they encountered famed frontiersman Kit Carson, who was carrying a message to Washington, stating California was secured by U.S. troops. Learning this, Kearny sent 200 of his men back to Santa Fe and ordered Carson to guide him to California. He was soon to learn this message was not entirely accurate.
Kit Carson was one of those characters of the American West that really captured people's imaginations and really highlighted the romanticism of the Wild West. He started his career escorting caravans of overlanders into New Mexico and throughout the frontier in the 1820s. And it wasn't until John C. Fremont and his wife, Jessie Hart Benton, went through the West on an expedition to chart and map a lot of the trails in the West that Kit Carson really got his fame. His career accelerated from that point of helping guide people throughout the West and becoming this illustrious outdoorsman. And it was during the Mexican-American War that Carson was chosen by Robert F. Stockton to send a message back to President Polk that California had been taken and that the American flag was hanging from every important post in the state. This message was premature, as it turned out. When Kit Carson delivered the message that California had already been taken, Kearny ended up sending half of his troops back.
After crossing the California desert with his reduced number of men, Kearny arrived at John Warner's rancho on December 2nd. At this time, Warner, an American immigrant who had recently acquired land by becoming a Mexican citizen, was being detained in San Diego. He had been arrested a few weeks prior by a U.S. reconnaissance patrol on suspicion of his loyalties. Meanwhile, California leader Antonio Coronel learned of Kearny's approach and sent a messenger to warn his men camped at the San Pasqual village, a few miles to the west. It is reported that California General Andres Pico, brother of Governor Pio Pico, did not believe this message. On December 6, 1846, General Kearny's troop advanced on the San Pasqual village. Pico's men were outnumbered and only had lances to fight. In an unusual tactic, Pico feigned a retreat only to surprise the Americans by turning to fight. Caught off guard, the Americans attempted to fire their rifles, only to discover the gunpowder was too damp to ignite. The soldiers resorted to using their sabers and rifle butts to defend themselves, but these weapons proved no match for the horse-mounted Californios and their lances. Kearny's troops were forced to take a defensive position atop a nearby hill and were quickly surrounded by the Californios. A Temecula Indian named Jose Tortuga assisted the Americans by sneaking past the Californio patrols, reaching San Diego on foot, and notifying the U.S. troops of the skirmish. Relief arrived on the third day, and by then, the Californios had fled the San Pasqual Valley. Due to the American casualties at San Pasqual, historical accounts have considered this event to be the deadliest battle of the Mexican-American War in California. However, the lesser-known events that followed prove there was tragically a greater loss of life yet to come.
The so-called Battle of San Pasqual, I don't know. There's sometimes you need to correct whether it was a battle, whether it was a war, was it a massacre. It certainly was an episode in the overall war between the United States and Mexico. met their demise there in Palma. It was a war. That's what happens when you're on the wrong side and you're captured and then outnumbered.
When news of the Battle of San Pasqual and the Palma Massacre reached the Temecula Indian village, the community responded to the region's mounting tensions by fleeing to Pauba, a region a few miles east. It was situated along the trail to Warner's Ranch and boasted a better tactical and defensive advantage than the Temecula village. It was also adjacent to a long, narrow canyon that would soon become both a strategic and yet tragic location. Tony Ashman, a Pachanga elder born in 1879, recounted the following story he heard regarding the days leading up to the massacre.
According to an old Temecula Indian, when he was a young man, he worked on the Santa Margarita Rancho. One day he was given an excellent horse and a message which he was to deliver to some Californios encamped near Temecula. He followed orders and found the Californios. After resting overnight, he was given a return message and once again admonished not to make any side trips. The young man was a Temecula, and so in spite of the warnings to the contrary, he decided to make a side trip and visit his home at the Temecula Indian village. When he arrived, he found the village deserted. He found an old, infirm Indian woman almost dead from thirst and hunger. He asked her where the people had gone, but she was too weak to speak. The young man brought her some water from the creek and mixed her a gruel of seed flour that he found in the house. Regaining strength, but still too weak to talk, she pointed toward the canyon which forms the northeastern portal into the Temecula Valley.
In the months leading up to the Battle of San Pasqual and the Palma Massacre, Californio leader José del Carmen Lugo participated in several skirmishes with U.S. troops and conducted numerous visits to Temecula village. Lugo was from a well-known family that owned vast tracts of land throughout San Bernardino and other areas in Southern California. He was well acquainted with the region and possessed detailed knowledge about the Temecula villagers, knowing their numbers, preparedness, and resources. Lugo's numerous patrols into Temecula would have alerted the people to the mounting tensions in the region. In response to the Palma Massacre, California General José María Flores in Los Angeles sent orders to Lugo to take a contingent of men to suppress what they believed to be the beginnings of an Indian uprising and to avenge the deaths of 11 men. Lugo called upon Cahuilla chief Juan Antonio for assistance. Juan Antonio and his followers had lived and worked on Lugo's rancho in San Bernardino and were guardians of the family's large landholdings. In the early 1840s, raids on California ranchos by tribes from the Colorado River area and as far away as Utah were a serious problem for the rancho landowners, and the Lugo family enlisted the services of Juan Antonio, who was loyal to the family, to protect their lands and livestock. Gathering a force of about 20 Californios, Lugo traveled to Santa Gertrudis, called Totpa in the native language, which is located on the road from San Jacinto to Temecula, near present-day Murrieta Hot Springs. While camped for several days awaiting reinforcement, Lugo learned from a reconnaissance mission to the Temecula village that he and his men were outnumbered. He sent word to California leader José Ramón Carrillo in San Luis Rey asking for additional support, while also summoning Juan Antonio and his men to assist them.
The Luceño warrior force was camped overnight, and Tavalquish, the quiver of one of the warriors, during the night, one of these quivers stood up on its own, as if the animal was still in it, and was on two legs, hind legs, like it was looking around. And some were quick to interpret, that's a bad sign, maybe we shouldn't be doing this, maybe we shouldn't proceed.
Carrillo arrived at Lugo's camp with a contingent of 10 additional men, joining Lugo and Juan Antonio's group of 50 to prepare for the ambush attack. Lugo was known to be a cautious man, and he understood that the men defending the Temecula village would defeat his small force if faced in an open battlefield. So a plan was devised to lure the Temecula people into a narrow canyon, away from their defensible position and into an ambush. Several years after the event, José del Carmen Lugo provided his first-hand account of the Temecula Massacre.
Fuimos juntos a Temecula, llevando 2 pedazos de paños blancos como señal de paz para los indígenas de Juan Antonio. We notified our people that we were leaving immediately to fight the hostile Indians at daybreak. We started at 11 o'clock at night. It was daylight when we came to the enemy. There were high hills and deep canyons, but not extensive. In one of the canyons from which we could reach the enemy, I placed an ambuscade of 50 Indians and 15 white men, with strict orders to not show themselves until the last of the Indian enemies passed. I stationed myself in the canyon with some men, and Carrillo went to trick the enemy by calling their attention and leading them to follow him. As soon as they saw him, they rose and went after him. He passed them, fired at them, and retreated slowly and in an orderly manner until he came to where I was. The Indians followed him eagerly. My men who had rifles and other good arms, of whom I had placed 5 on ridges or high places in the canyon, were told to fire only at the fighters because they were the chiefs and came only in the middle of the main body. We lured them on about a league until they passed the ambuscade. Then the men rushed out from the ambush upon them from the back at the same time that we fought them from the front. We made a great slaughter, and falling upon them from the rear, killed many of them. Before reaching Aguanga in their flight, 18 or 20 of them turned back and gave up their arms. They were made prisoners and placed in charge of Chief Juan Antonio, who told me to care for them and he would care for the prisoners. On reaching Aguanga, we amused ourselves, killing some 3 Indians who continued fighting. After terminating the affair, in which perhaps 100 Indians perished, we went back to Juan Antonio and found he had killed all the prisoners. I reproached him for these acts of cruelty, and he answered me very coolly that he had gone to hunt and fight and kill Indians who would kill him, that he was sure that if they caught him, they would not have spared his life but would have burned him alive.
News of the massacre reached General Kearny and his troops. Dr. John S. Griffin, a physician to the soldiers, documented the tragic events in his diary on December 30th, 1846.
We received report today that the Mexicans and a party of Indians had attacked the Indians about Warner's Ranch and killed some 30 of them.
Lugo reprimanded Juan Antonio for executing the Temecula captives, but ultimately rewarded him for the killings.
This was really a dastardly act, and it really is probably there was already a knife in the back, right? But this is where the knife gets twisted, and it just really seemed to be a senseless act. There really didn't seem to be any reason for that.
Juan Antonio's rationale was that while Lugo was captain of the Californios, he was put in charge of the Cahuilla fighters, and that he could punish the Temecula prisoners however he saw fit. If the circumstances were reversed, he reasoned, the Temecula men would not have spared the Cahuillas. Only 6 of Lugo's men were wounded, and no deaths were recorded. Californio Diego Sepulveda arrived after the massacre with 25 additional men from Los Angeles, believing that retaliation was imminent. They returned to the canyon to only find the old and infirm remained.
The people that were killed here in this canyon, they were left here for up to several weeks, maybe a month, and because after the battle, the massacre, people are just trying to survive and hiding, and so the bodies, they just laid here for weeks, you know, like I said. And so the wild animals, coyotes, other, you know, creatures came and ate some of the bodies, and their bones and pieces were scattered all over here. And so when the Mexicans and the Cahuillas left, we came back here, our people, and gathered up whatever they could find, you know, the remains, and they took them
about people and families and plants and animals. So it's just really a he introduces information about the Temecula Massacre. If someone was just looking at the recording, listening to the recording, and they didn't know anything about the massacre, it would probably not make sense and maybe not be understood as to what it really meant. But when we came across this sound recording and really listened to what he was, the information he was providing, we realized that it was a first-hand account of the Temecula Massacre.
Porque los comieron los coyotes a la gente. Y los coches, yo no sé de dónde vinieron también, toditos comieron a la gente. Pero los puros huesos, las calaveras, ese nomás se empenaban a hacer los huesos, los pedazos. Así nomás. Lo llevaron para allá. Lo llevaron a tener por allá, donde está la compañía más el cementerio ahora. Hacían un sepultura grande, así en la redonda, fondo como de 6 pies de hondura, ancho. Ahí nomás vaciaban los huesos que viven en las carretas. Ahí nomás la van enterrando los puros huesos. Para las mujeres que se vean que tendrían dinero cuando vinieron de las misiones, algunos, pues que traigan un ñudo así, en un paño, en un trapo, lo tiraban allá al hoyo, donde ya echaban los huesos.
So because we know that Sargento is referring to the place where the massacre occurred, and the fact that he's talking about the dead, we knew that was related to the Temecula Massacre from other information provided from other sources. But he really provided some of the most important information for the tribe in regards to what happened to the people who were slain during this massacre, and then what happened to their remains after the fact. At that time, Sargento would have been a young boy, maybe under 10 years old. So he probably remembered the experience, knew what was happening to some extent. So his information really was the only tribal information from the tribal perspective that we've found regarding the massacre. The only other first-hand account that we know of is Lugo's account, who was the leader of the Californios.
Another interesting part of the story is that it was understood that California was secure for the United States. But when Kit Carson met up with the General Kearney, he said, "Don't go back to Washington, D.C. and report that. Instead, we need the Mormon Battalion to continue down to San Diego because there's still an insecurity."
The Mormon Battalion was formed in Council Bluffs, Iowa, as a unit of the Army of the West. Led by Philip St. George Cook, the mission was to follow Kearny's troops and establish a wagon road and deliver additional horses to California. The Mormon Battalion differed from other military contingents in that the group also brought with them the wives of some officers and settlers.
When you talk about the Mormon Battalion and their interaction in the Mexican-American War, they were a people group who were persecuted. There was a lot of violence toward them. They fled, they went up to Council Bluffs, Iowa, which was on the Missouri River on the western side. They asked the government of the United States if they could get a job for the United States to help them get over to Salt Lake City. And President Polk said, "How about marching down to San Diego and helping us fight in the Mexican-American War?"
The Mormon Battalion arrived at Warner's Ranch on January 21, 1847, a full month after the massacre. There, they learned of the recent events, and Sergeant Daniel Tyler recorded some of this correspondence in his diary.
They were friendly to the United States government and had recently captured, brought here, and killed some 10 or 11 Californians. They had, however, lost 38 of their own number, killed by Californians and some other hostile tribe in retaliation in Temecula Valley, who lay in ambush and took them by surprise. These Indians begged the colonel to allow them to accompany the battalion that they might bury their dead on the way, and the colonel consented.
There have been varying accounts of how many people were killed here in this area, and personally I think it was over 100. Our village at the time, some of us estimate it was about 300 people, Temecula Indians. If you lose up to 100, you lose a third of your your community, and that's a huge, huge loss.
And if Lugo wrote in his diary that he saw 100 folks, I think you have to put a lot of stock in that. He knew what he saw.
After leaving Warner Springs, heavy rain forced the battalion to camp a few miles east of Temecula because the creek was too high to cross. Some of the native people slept next to battalion members' tents for protection and asked for assistance in collecting the dead for burial. When the Mormon Battalion reached Temecula Village on January 25, 1847, the native people buried their dead in a mass grave at the cemetery, which is located about 6 miles from the massacre site. The fact that the remains from the massacre were brought to Temecula from present-day Butterfield Valley and Owanga over a distance of 10 to 15 miles indicates the cemetery was already an established burial and cremation area for the Temecula village community, despite an 1867 source saying that it was a new graveyard.
This whole valley from, Vail headquarters on toward what's now Vail Lake and up through there is probably seeded with bones from the people. And through the years, it has been respected, even by the settlers, the European settlers.
Even though this
February 13, 1847, the United States agreed upon a ceasefire with Mexico. A year later, the two countries signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which formally ended the war between the two nations and ceded Mexico's northern provinces to the United States. The city of Temecula deeded the cemetery parcel to the Pechanga tribe, who oversee the upkeep of the grounds. Today, the graves of the victims of the bloodiest battle of the Mexican-American War in California sits behind an unassuming fenced area in a shopping center parking lot in Temecula.
it's a little bittersweet being here. Especially this parking lot, they wonder, why is this weird wall around this just isolated piece of property? And sometimes they'll find out why, that it's a historic cemetery,
I think the people that are in these businesses, and they would be blown away. They would be sad if they actually knew what it was, which they don't. They don't know it's there, and you know, ignorance is bliss.
This was a pre-existing ceremonial area, and when the massacre happened in 1846, many of the bodies were brought back here, and you know, its use was continued, but in a different form. And so the tribe had to fight really hard to preserve this little half-acre site. We were here with archaeologists, you know, because as developers, they want to make the site as small as they can get so they can develop everything. And so they were doing testing around the area and bringing it in to determine the size. And there was a lot of things here that we found. In the corner behind me, we saw evidence of cremations. So things like that tells us that this is a much older site.
So during construction, snow fence is put up, and then chain link fence for the actual area that's getting developed or not getting developed. So you have a good line. You know, people won't with equipment won't go past. And they said that they could see remains outside of what's now the gate and the fence. So yeah, that's a real important aspect that we don't, you know, talk about too much.
We capped it. There's about 4 feet of fill on this area, so we're higher than the rest of the area, and that was mainly to stop pot hunters and people that wanted to dig up Indian skulls and, you know, things that are still popular today. The most deaths during the Mexican-American War in California were right here. And so they wonder, why isn't there a plaque, you know, noting that? It's very historical to the state of California, in particular to the city of Temecula. And again, we've made a decision. It's not something we want to celebrate or even, you know, put a plaque like it's something that we should be proud of. So we note it in our own way, and like I said, it's bittersweet. It's troubling to me even to be here. Traditionally, the Pechanga people, we have 6 directions. Tumaumic, Cuemic, Quichimic, Payomic, which are north, east, south, and west, and always in that order. But we have 2 more. Momat Pashonik, the center, literally means the center of the ocean. And the last one is up, Escalation, where the heaven is, where our souls finally go. Our most sacred direction is north, Tumaumic. Our ceremonial structures are always oriented to north, astronomical north, the North Star. And in 1880, there was a traveler that came through the valley. He noticed that the graves were oriented to the north instead of the east. Because most cemeteries back then were overseen by the Catholic Church, and most of those are oriented to east.
Dr. Woodward, our archivist, came across a photo of the cemetery looking towards Puesca, showing that connection from this place to the place of creation and the place of the first death of the world of Huayol. It was very important to show the photo, and in that you're seeing Temecula before rooftops and Walmarts and stores and streets, and you know how place and time is connected, as you have that continuity. It's such a case study in how to disrespect a place that is so important to a culture, to history, and we feel like it's the right time to finally tell our story about this place and tell people how important it is to our culture and how it shouldn't be set on the margin. It's very important. 2 nights after Halloween, we celebrate Tikitikish, which means to be lit continually, and so that's the way that we celebrate All Souls Day. Candle lighting is a way we remember our ancestors, and it's very important that we light 1 candle for everybody that we have in our cemetery, and people that aren't even there. And then also to light a candle for those people murdered at the massacre.
We've lost many of our ceremonies over the years, but one of the few ceremonies we do still have are our death ceremonies, remembering our ancestors. So we always come back every year into our cemeteries, and we do candle lighting. We light candles on the graves, and it's almost like a celebration, I would say. It's like a family reunion. It's not generally a sad time. So we do it at Pechanga. We have a cemetery there, and we come over here too. So it's things like that. It's a very private thing, you know. Outside, you know, there's these historical monuments. This is where the founders, you know, settled their site. This is where the Battle of Gettysburg is, and for us, it's you know, it's bittersweet. And so we've had a lot of internal dialogue among the tribe. Well, how much of this do we talk about? It's a tough thing, you know, because as Native people, you know, we dance in two worlds now. You know, so we have to live here, you know. We're part of the community, but we're also part of the tribe. We're a sovereign nation.